Hey everyone, welcome back to Bridge Stories. You are listening to Season 2. If you're new to our podcast, this is our place where we just sit down and give people space and time to tell stories of how they've encountered God and been changed by Him. This season we're going to be sitting down with some familiar faces to many of you, and we hope that you'll get a little deeper glimpse into who they are and the things that God has brought them through. We're also excited to get to introduce you to some new people, some people with some incredible stories to share of how God has provided and encouraged them and helped them to live out a life of faith. We hope that these stories encourage you and challenge you in your faith as you walk closer to Jesus than ever before, as you seek Him with all of your heart. So sit back and enjoy and be encouraged as you listen. With that, let's jump in. All right, we're back. Here we go. Haley, welcome.
Thanks.
Glad that you said yes to this. I think I've told a few people this. I feel like this is probably the moment where we get to go from acquaintances to friends. So I'm excited to learn more about you, to hear more about your story. And like I was literally just telling you before we started, I'm excited for especially young people to hear your story. So we won't belabor that, but let's just talk about you. So where'd you come from? And how did you, we'll just kind of build a road for how you got to this moment sitting here and then talk about the future. But where'd you grow up? And tell us about that.
Yeah, so I'm from Southern California, grew up in Anaheim area, but like the Anaheim Hills part, so it's quite nice there. The good section. But went to Esperanza High School, if there's any Esperanza alum. Grew up in a ministry family, so my parents were part of, my dad in particular, planted a church out of Melody Land, and that was kind of a connection in Zion's history as well, I think. But he and some buddies planted a church, and that was where my parents were engaged in ministry for about 30 years. So my sister and I grew up there and had the privilege of kind of being raised in an environment where the gospel was told to us from a really young age. Which was a gift.
There's a lot of people here that were from kind of that Melody Land split who will know. So who's your dad? And tell us a little bit about him for people.
He's Ken Wilson, if anybody knows Ken. I'm Joan Wilson's granddaughter, if people know Joan. So that's who he is.
Awesome. And you said you, part of your story is just you kind of knew the gospel from the very beginning of life. Everyone has a different experience with being a PK, a pastor's kid. What was that kind of like for you? Did you feel pressure? Did you feel like it was just a major blessing from start to finish? What was that like for you?
I think for me, I was a youngest child, so my sister paved the way in some things, which helped. And I really enjoyed being on the ministry side. I liked going to church early. I liked cleaning up after events. I liked being kind of in the behind the scenes of what was happening in the church body. And for me, it worked out that I just did have a good relationship with my parents, and they were really integral in helping me understand who God was in tangible ways from a young age. So I think in kind of the early years of my life, that was definitely a gift. Definitely as I was growing in my faith, I felt that pressure, and I still feel it now of like, someone asks you a question like, how are you? And you're like, I'm good. It's like just the first response. And I think that can come sometimes with being in ministry. You don't always feel that freedom to dive deeply into like, actually, I'm not good, and this is why, or I'm struggling with this particular area or sin, or so it took me much longer, whether that was a personality thing or a result of being in, ministry and being in a PK. I'm not sure. I think there's probably a bit of both, but it took me a little bit longer to be like, it's okay to not be okay. Like, it's okay to admit that you're wrestling through something theologically or have questions and doubts about something in Scripture. But I do think my parents created a safe space to ask those questions. Whether or not I felt I could to a larger church body, I think took time. But at least in our home, it felt like a safe space for me to do that. So
like you were allowed to just be you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so cool. I think sometimes some of the saddest stories are pastors' kids who feel like they have to perform to maintain mom or dad's image a little bit. It's always sad when you hear those stories, but it doesn't sound like that was your story.
That was not my experience. Yeah, I think in particular, for whatever reason, when my dad was the one who would put me to bed, And for whatever reason, that was like my time when questions would just come alive in my mind. So, 30 minutes later, my mom would be knocking on the door like, Ken, presumably that was their time together, right? She's probably out there with a movie ready to go, like, he's going to put her to bed and come. And I'm like, so the rapture, like, I don't understand. We're swept up in the air. Are we not? What's going to happen? I remember one time distinctly, like, asking my dad, like, well, if we're swept up in the air, will you hold my hand? And he said, yes. And I was like, okay, then I'm good with it. If that's what happens, I'll be good.
Of all the hangups in the rapture, you just wanted to make sure Dad would hold your hand.
I want to know, like, will I have a buddy? So I guess I'm going to have to stay close to him because we don't know when that will happen.
How old were you when you were asking those questions?
I don't know. I think I was probably like 6 or 7. I was kind of young, maybe 8. Yeah.
It's funny what questions kids ask. I was driving my son to school today, and we were listening to that old song, Joshua Fought the Battle of Jericho.
I don't know.
You heard it at school. It's like an 80s, it's just like an old school Sunday school song. But we were listening to it on repeat, so I had the joy of listening to it like probably 7, 8 times in one drive. And then I muted it because he said, Dad, so I muted it. What is it? He's like, was he in the line of people when the walls came down, or did he just make the walls come down from up in heaven? And I'm like,
that's a fair question.
Oh, yeah. Good question, buddy.
Yeah.
And then the classic, what do you think?
Yeah.
Equals buy some time to figure out what I think.
Holy Spirit. Yeah.
I think he was fighting with them. I'm like, I think I like how you're thinking, and that was enough for him this time. But
that's good.
You always think you're gonna give your kids the Bible, and it's gonna be this beautiful thing, and the questions always expose the one thing that you haven't thought through.
Yeah. Totally. I remember talking to a group of elementary school kids one time, and we were talking about creation. And one of them raised their hand and said, if God created the earth, who created God? And I was like, you're 4, like you should, the depth to ask that question. Yeah. And then you're like, what do you say? You're like, he just always was. And that sounds so dissatisfying. Yeah. Like, how can that be? Those are the best.
So you grew up basically from birth all the way through high school graduation in Anaheim.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one single spot, which is also unique because a lot of pastors' kids are kind of uprooted and go to multiple places, and they have that experience. So that's awesome. So you finished high school. How was high school for you? I ask everyone that because a lot of high schoolers listen to this. So how was high school for you?
I had the gift of a good group of friends, so that helped a lot. I had some friends who kind of came with me even from elementary school, and we were together all the way through high school. But, it was dramatic. It's just a dramatic time. You think that everything's the end of the world. When I look back at journals now from that time, I'm like, I don't know. Should I hide these? Like, it's just...
Should I burn them?
Yeah, do I burn it? Or is it a critical part of my history? Yeah, so it felt dramatic, but I enjoyed it overall. And I think I had the gift, like I said, of good friends, which helped a lot.
Yeah. So I think it might be important in this moment to maybe just briefly maybe describe to people what you do or feel called to. We'll get into the details later because I know a lot of that kind of began to come out of you in high school. Yes. So why don't, just for context, just let people know kind of what you're doing, where you're at now, and then let's go back to high school and talk about where that started for you.
Sounds good. So, yeah, I've been working in international relief and missions work for the last 7.5 years. So I started working for Samaritan's Purse International and got to be with them in different countries around the world, but most recently was in northern Iraq for about 4 years and did a lot of different types of roles in my time with them. I was working sometimes in random things like travel, booking flights for people, but in a field location, but grew to a point where I was engaged more in direct programming, helping figure out, how could we serve a community in a way that leads to gospel opportunities and opportunities to build relationship. And then in this year, have kind of been spending some time back in California, taking a break with family, but just started with a new missions organization called Ananias House about a month ago. And so I'm looking to go back overseas with them next year, hopefully in the Middle East, but depending on how the conflict shakes out right now. But hopefully that will come to pass. Regardless, I'm supporting remotely from California for right now.
Yeah.
So
that's a pretty deep 45 seconds. And like I said, we'll dive into it. But I think normal people who are just listening might hear and think like, oh, wow, young, awesome, articulate woman who goes into missions in what I've seen on the news as pretty sketchy locations. But we were talking this last Sunday. This is not something that you just wake up and decide, I'm going to go. And if you do, you probably won't last long. This is a calling to ministry. So let's talk about how you began to discern a sense of calling into this being the life that God had for you.
yeah, great question. It definitely, it's easy to sound like it all came together and just wrapped up in a nice bow. But I have really, from my earliest days, dealt with a lot of fear. And so people who are close to me look at what God has done in my life and really see like that is only by the work of God that you've been able to do what he's asked you to do. So yeah, high school was a pivotal time for me, but I think I would even start back as a young child, kind of back in those days when, even in those times when my dad was putting me to bed at night and answering those questions. My family and my mom in particular, she was with us, day after day, was very careful about what she let us watch and all of that. We had a really safe home environment. But for whatever reason, I had a lot of nightmares. And so I was, as a child, very fearful, afraid of the dark, waking up, often calling for my parents, and just scary things that were happening just in my dreams. And so I'd wake up and then yell for usually my dad. And of course, my mom is, waking him up because my dad would have never heard me if she hadn't shaken him awake. And that was something that I think my parents both used to say, like, we're here right now, but God is the one who is always here and he can protect you, from anything. And he promises to always be with us. He has all power. So they use that to communicate truth about God's character in a way that was most meaningful for me in that moment in my life as a child. And that was one of the first aspects of God's character that I started to understand when I was deciding really to follow Christ, was like, he's always with me. So he's the one, in the absence of my earthly father who I can call and he will come. So that was something I think that God started planting then really early on. And then with that, kind of as a family, we were always kind of road trippers. We didn't do a lot of international trips, but I was very curious about just international locations. So I'd be ripping, magazine pages out, putting them up on my wall, like, I'm going to travel there someday. But then at the same time, we would travel into LA, the city of LA. And I was like, it's too much. It's too loud. There's a lot of homeless people. I'm uncomfortable. I don't know how to interact. I don't know what to do. And it is uncomfortable when you feel like, it's wrong. Someone's sleeping on the street. They don't have enough food. They don't, maybe there's some mental health issues there. And then you're also like, I'm totally taken care of. There's that kind of guilt factor, but I just felt uncomfortable. And like I said, I didn't really know how to enter into that space of such a very different life than the one that I had grown up with. And so that was something that really was like a theme throughout my life, was just this fear and resistance to discomfort. Like not even just in our local area. I was not heavily involved in doing things that were taking me out of my comfort zone. But I had the opportunity when I was in high school to do a short-term mission trip to Mexico. That was with my dad and two of my aunts, and my older sister went. So it's like, out of your comfort zone, but lots of family in a bubble. Yep. Yeah. And that was the first time that I really traveled cross-culturally and internationally. And exposed me just to some of the work that was there. It was just kind of a like dip in of like, this is what it's like. This is what life is like for people in a different part of the world, kind of eye-opening, like so many short-term mission trips are. I don't think I contributed a lot. I remember we built a house and I was like dripping paint off of the roller, walking across the floor. They were like, but, I'm sure that they still have paint splattered across their floor today. Hopefully it's a good memory. So it was a first exposure. And then later on in high school, I forget what year this was, but maybe it was 2010 or 2011. There was an earthquake and tsunami in Japan that took thousands of lives. And I either read or heard this story about a mom who, when the waves were coming of the tsunami, she had 2 children, and she clung to a pole and she clung to her children. And when the wave washed over her and pulled back, one of her children was gone. And I was just like hit to the core of what that would feel like for her. And yet I'm in Southern California in this really nice, beautiful home with parents who love me, where no, threat really is coming to my safety. And it's like, what can I do for that mom in Japan? What can I do? And so I was laying on the floor of my room, throwing a soccer ball over my head, talking to God. And I felt like he said, like, you can help. And so I was like, okay. So the most obvious thing to me was like, I guess we can raise money. So I went to my parents and a couple people in my church and said, like, I want to do some relief, like fundraising for this, response. And so they were like, okay, so what do you want to do? So we arranged a few different events. We did like a bake sale, a church barbecue, and I had very musically talented friends in high school. And so I finagled them into doing a benefit concert at our church. And I think it went pretty well in my memory, but I would have to go back and ask them. I was so nervous that I said nothing and did nothing. Not once did I say, this is why we're doing this event. I have no idea who took care of those things, but I think we had some talented singers that carried the event through. And we raised $2,000, and I sent it to Samaritan's Purse. And I got a personal letter back from them that actually was signed. It was written and signed by one of the women who was one of my first supervisors years later, when I actually got an internship with them, which was very cool. And when that happened, it would be, I think on one hand you could say it makes me feel good because I did something, we raised money.
Right.
And, you can kind of walk away. But I think for me, it was God saying, I've given you a heart of compassion that you are meant to couple with action. And that is core to the character of Jesus. He was constantly entering into other people's burdens and allowed himself to, at the very least emotionally suffer with people in grief and in anguish and in heartache and relational strife. There's moments throughout his life where you see that, and it's uncomfortable, but that's what he models for us. So it's when things like that happen, like what happened in Japan, my first response is this is so tragic and terrible, or this is so uncomfortable. What do I do with this, this homeless person in LA? I'm just going to keep to myself, kind of cower inside. Or you can follow the example of Jesus, which is to take a step forward. So for me, it was more about action than any particular amount that we raised, or we'll just give money and that will be fine. So that was kind of one of the first moments where I felt like God was clearly showing me something that I could do. And then towards the end of high school, I had gone to public school, and I was really interested in learning more depth of theology. So I started applying to Christian schools, and again, didn't want to leave my area. I was I'm not going to leave California.
So which ones did you apply to?
I applied to Biola University, Azusa, Point Loma, Vanguard. I think I did Cal State Fullerton as a backup if you just want to live at home. And
yeah.
So
basically if people
anywhere
don't know, we are
was,
living in one of the
driving
only
distance.
places that has that many Christian universities.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting.
Yes.
How it works out.
And to attend any of them, I could have lived at home, where I was.
Yeah.
But I did have the opportunity to live on campus, but it was I was looking for that close.
There was still very much in you, even with those experiences, kind of the deep desire for comfort and safety and kind of pushing fear away from yourself. and home kind of created home base. I know the area. I know how to navigate this.
Right.
Okay, so I know you ended up at Biola. Is that you could share how that happened if you'd like to, but
It's not really a story. Yeah, I just did a pro and con list. Chose Biola, really.
nice. Just a good old 2-column pros versus cons.
That's right.
What were the cons for Point Loma Nazarene University?
You know, it was actually between Biola and Point Loma.
Okay.
My best friend wanted to go to Point Loma, and I was standing there. We were watching the sun set on the cliffs, and I thought, like, this is it. But they, in some of the people that I talked to, didn't have the same depth of, I don't know if that's true, like theology that they were offering in some of their courses compared to what Biola offered.
Yeah.
And that was why I was going to a Christian school.
I attended there, full disclosure, but I also attended there and said yes to go there about 3 months after I found out Christian university was even a thing. So I didn't grow up in the culture. I had no idea that was a thing. Yeah. Very late, like, oh, the Christians have their own universities? What's that about? Yeah. And I went to this one. I'm like, I don't know. I'll just choose this one so I don't have to deal with the stress of. Yeah, that's how I ended up there. So you're not offending me at all. So you go to Biola. You're. What's interesting is in all of this, you're talking about, like, I'm connecting dots, like deep questions that as a child for your dad, even in fear and the desire for comfort. Still feeling like God's voice is in your life and you're looking for it, and then kind of walking that out all the way to kind of formal education to learning more about this. So what were the early days at Biola like for you, especially coming from a public school into a very not public school?
Yes. I mean, I think one of the first things kind of during their early, I don't know, it's like Freshers Week, whatever it's called there. Oh, maybe that's a British thing. Anyway, we have a term for it in the U.S.
Oh, like the intro period for
freshmen. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they do this really big worship night. They pray over you. You take communion with your family. So I was like, this is great. You know, they're just setting the tone full in, totally all about it. So I kind of loved that aspect because it was blending what was so much part of my life and kind of growing up in a ministry setting. But then I grew up in a church where people were really, really wonderful at praying. There wasn't as much that depth of theology and understanding of the biblical narrative. It was like a, felt board kind of Sunday school, like this is Moses, here he is. And you don't necessarily know how that fits into the larger picture. And so Biola, one of my first couple weeks there, I was in an Old Testament survey class where the professor stood on a stage just like this, and he started out like walking across the stage, started on one side of the stage and said, like, this is creation. God creates the world, creates Adam and Eve, sin breaks that relationship, then he makes this covenant, with Noah. He makes it and he just walked you through the biblical narrative in like the highlights all the way up through Jesus to Jesus' return. And it was a big auditorium, and I was sitting like kind of in the back, and I wanted to stand up and be like, it's one story? Like, what do you mean? I just had never understood really how it all connected. I had faith in Jesus, and I understood that aspect of like, yeah, he's covered my sins. And there's these kind of cherry picking of things that we live like now. The Spirit helps us do that. And there's these great characters of faith that we see, but mostly, like I had no idea that it was connected. Yeah. And I just learned so much there about that larger narrative that I had never really learned before, even though I grew up in the church. And I also had some professors that had a heart for unreached people groups. And that was also the first time that I had ever heard that there was places in the world that were completely unreached with the gospel, that there was, millions of people in the world who are living in a place where, whether it's just because it's culturally not the norm or location or whatever the hardship is, they don't have access to the gospel. And so I was like, do we quit college and go right now? Like, and my friends were like, probably not, like maybe finish. So I think early on, God started to put meat around some of these questions that I had, some of the compassion, desire to maybe, it's like, is it travel? You kind of care about people. But he was refining it to say, like, yes, of course, meeting physical and emotional needs and all of that is important, but I'm most interested in people, like, knowing who I am. I want them to worship me and have a relationship with me. And there are people who don't know. So just refining that to say, like, this is the target goal. All these other things are the path, and they're a part of it, but it's the goal.
It's really interesting. It sounds like one of those moments where you hear something that, whether you recognize it in the moment or not, is like one of those pivot points of this is new information to me, and the way that God's making me receive it is going to force me to wrestle with the next question, which is like, what do I do about it?
Yes.
Almost like your same response to Japan has a tsunami. What do I do about it? Mm-hmm. Let me pull this a little closer to you. Make sure there we go. So you're at Biola. It sounds like from a very, very early stage at formally studying, these things are already starting to come up in you. This is not like, I wonder what I'm going to do or what I'm interested in. It sounds like those seeds are now not just planted, they're starting to grow.
Yes.
So walk us through, because, college is kind of like high school. When you're there, it seems like it takes forever in some ways, and there's so many stories. And then in retrospect, it seems like you fell asleep and woke up and you were done.
Right.
What were some of the other maybe formative relationships or classes that kind of just continued to nudge and push you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think early on I had chosen my major, intercultural studies, and more, again, out of a heart of like, maybe interested in traveling, maybe interested in helping people, not necessarily missions yet.
Okay.
But maybe, yeah. But it was like, so like you said, there's those seeds being planted, and God was kind of refining things shortly after I got there of like, this is what I'm interested in. This is the goal. But I was with a lot of peers who had, in my view, a lot more qualifications than I did and more clarity in their calling. I remember sitting in some of my classes and having my peers say like, yeah, God told me when I was 9 years old that I was going to be a missionary to this place. And I was like, when I was 9, I was, picking up roly-polies. Like, I don't know. I was not thinking about
Asking
that.
Dad if we can hold hands during the rapture.
Can we hold hands during the rapture? Yeah. I was thinking about other things. And so... yeah, I think there was some insecurity there for sure in the beginning, because it felt like there's a lot of other people who they see, they've traveled a lot already. Maybe they grew up as a missionary kid. Mm-hmm. Maybe they grew up internationally, whatever it was. Biola kind of draws actually a pretty wide crowd from all over the U.S. and even the world. So I was like, maybe this is wrong. But I just hung with it, and I think God helped me see over that time, like, I will equip you to do what I'm asking you to do.
Yeah, I sorry to interrupt you. I do have a question. So I've been in similar situations. So I assume if you're in this environment, you're also, especially from maybe kids who grew up on the mission field, you're hearing stories and things that happen. How is this striking you as a young adult who has already told us you're dealing with a lot of fear and desire to be comfortable? Because now it's not, we're going to cross the border for a weekend, build a house, and come home. Now you're hearing, oh, this is not a romantic vacation. Some of these things are devastating. How are these things hitting you in those moments?
I think I didn't really have the capacity at that time to understand what it was going to be like. I think there's things I didn't understand until I was actually already overseas in the middle doing what I was doing and realizing like this is the cost and some of the hardship here.
Like you can't learn it unless you're on the ground.
I think so. I think it's one of those things that it's very hard to prepare in advance for what it will feel like if you're in a situation that feels a little bit unsafe, or not to say that God isn't preparing you, but your awareness of like, I know all that I need to know and it's all going to be fine. I don't think that really came to me in advance. But I did feel I was concerned about being alone. So that was one of the big things that I really started asking as I was hearing from peers and different things and learning about, different mission movements around the world throughout history and things like that. My main ask was like, I don't want to go alone. You give me a friend. So I think probably in my junior year, between the people groups we had been learning about, and even I had some practical classes in international relief and development that were teaching you the basics of like writing a program, asking for a grant, things like that, that were giving me some good skills to say like, okay, I feel like some pieces are coming together. I knew really by my junior year, like, I think God is going to ask me to do something with this, but I don't know exactly what it will look like. But Lord, if I go, can you give me a friend? And that was my like ask. Again, laying in my bed at night, like, this is what I need. So, and he did. I mean, we'll get there later, but he did meet that for me. So I think he met the concern that I voiced at that time, and there was other concerns that I probably didn't know to voice, but he also was taking care of.
Yeah. So you finished there, and I know you said that you had an internship with Samaritan's Purse. Is that while you're still in school?
No, Samaritan's Purse recruits heavily from Biola. They were coming and presenting in my classes and towards the tail end of my time.
Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. I think people are probably like, what is Samaritan's Purse? I'm assuming that I know what that is, and you know what that is. Tell people what Samaritan's Purse is.
Samaritan's Purse is an international relief organization. They're faith-based. They're based out of Boone, North Carolina. It's a little mountain town, but they work all over the world. And they respond to humanitarian emergencies, whether it's a natural disaster, a conflict that's displacing people. And they typically set up, an initial response there. In recent years, they've developed field hospitals that they can deploy and do big medical responses. And at times, they stay longer in a country if there's more opportunity to do longer-term programming and the needs are there and all of that. So,
okay. Yeah. Very good.
So they, as an organization, were coming, presenting, and it was at a time when in the Middle East, Islamic State was gaining territory. So we were hearing about it on the news here in the U.S., and Samaritan's Purse was kind of running towards the fire. They were coming in our classes saying, like, this is what's happening in that area and the conflict. And
people idea of what area, what time are we talking about here?
This was in like 2014, 2015, and they were in Syria and Iraq, particularly northern Iraq. So Samaritan's Purse had set up a field hospital there, and they were receiving just from both sides, combatant and non-combatant, and serving through a medical channel. But out of that, they had a lot of other programming that came with, food distributions and things like that as needs arose. So they were sharing that in these college classes, and I was like, there's a fire, they're running towards it, and I'm interested in being a part of that. And so I had, despite fear still, because it really sounds like one of those things, like, why would you want to be a part of that if you're a person that's afraid and they're saying, like, we're going into territory where Islamic State is taking more and more ground. But I had just like a burning desire to be a part of it. And so I applied for an internship and got it. And 4 days after I graduated from Biola, I was on a plane to North Carolina. And that was kind of my first experience with them, was in the U.S., learning about the organization and making connections. And a lot of it was just me learning things. But I got my first international internship with them that fall, so not even a year after I had graduated. And that was kind of my first jump overseas.
And paint a picture. So you had told me on Sunday that you were even scared of getting on an airplane. Now you're not just like getting on an airplane to go visit some friends.
Right.
You're getting on an airplane to go a very different place. So tell everyone, paint a picture for where you go and what you do.
Yeah, I had been on a plane one time when I was 5 to go to Texas and visit family. And then never again until I was in college. I did a short-term mission trip to Australia, and I did a study abroad.
Okay.
And that kind of actually was helping expose me in those times a lot more to just like the basics of travel and all of that in English-speaking countries.
Where did you study abroad?
I studied abroad in the UK, in
Okay.
London.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, very fun. Yeah. Highly recommend it. So I got some of my jitters of flying and all of that, and just having to, figure things out while you're traveling out during that time, which helped. So by the time I was hopping on a plane to go to, which my first place that I went to was Uganda,
Okay.
I had a little bit more experience and practice then, but I still, there's nothing really prepares you for landing at midnight in a foreign country where you don't know the name of the person who's picking you up, and you're just out there standing in front of an airport, and it's like, anywhere.
Were you with a friend?
I was not with a friend, but God did send, I had asked him, like I said, I want a friend. And in the first layover that I had, I met a missionary who worked in East Africa. He was an older man, had worked there for decades. And he just, I think really the Lord just prompted him to come over and strike up a conversation with me. And he told me what it was going to be like living there, talk to me. And then I sat on the plane next to a plane buddy who was another believer that chatted with me. And it was like an immediate answer to prayer of God in that anxious time of like, I've packed my bags. I don't know what I'm going to. I've left my family and I don't know where this is going to lead. He immediately said, like, I heard your prayer and I'm with you. And it's like an echo back to that first thing that he was teaching me about his character when I was a child. It's like, I am always with you.
Yeah. Yeah. So what were you doing in Uganda, and what was kind of your first impression of feet on the ground? This is now my life.
Yeah. Uganda, it was a mixed bag. Like that first, if you travel to anywhere and you land there at midnight, it's just going to be a weird first impression. It's like cars hurtling towards you on the road, and you're like, who's going to, are we just going to head on,
like the
collide,
game of chicken?
or who's going to, yeah. And the air smells like a bonfire, and it's just kind of sensory overload.
Okay.
That was kind of my first experience there. It's like sensory overload, jet lagged. You wake up the next day, you're meeting a ton of people. They're not jet lagged. So they're, full of energy, and you're like, I haven't eaten, and no one knows that I haven't eaten. And, I'm having trouble focusing, and everything's new. So it is really like kind of a wild experience to go somewhere so different. Yeah. But while I was there, I was working, it was an internship, and I was helping them figure out in the different sectors that they worked in, whether that was providing food or livelihood or education, how to integrate more biblical messaging. So depending on the type of grant that you have, sometimes there's restrictions and you can't do it, but if a Christian organization is funding their own programming, then they have all freedom to be able to integrate it as far as much as the community will accept it. And Uganda is pretty open. So yeah, we were just looking at like, what are creative ways that we can integrate biblical values into these lessons on farming and things like that. But for me, I think more than what I contributed, I was gaining a lot of just experience of being put into various field sites throughout the country. They would stick you in a car, give you no instructions, send you with a local staff member, and you would just be plopped in the middle of like a church of people waiting for you. And you're like, what are they waiting for? But they're waiting for me. So I'd better say something. Like, I'd better have a plan. And I don't think that's unique to any one organization. I think there's a sense in which whether it is, relief work, missions work, a lot of times you're jumping into the middle of like a train that is moving. So there's not always a lot of time to say like, here's the expectations. This is what you're going to be doing. There's a little bit of that, but a lot of it.
Next 2 weeks, you're going to slowly onboard.
Not at all. Yeah. There is no freshers orientation week. It's just like hop in. So yeah, some of it is fun because you're riding on the back of a dirt bike, weaving through villages and, playing soccer with kids and trying new foods. And some of it is using pit latrines to go to the bathroom and being incredibly hot and uncomfortable and getting food poisoning. So it's like mixed bag. And I think, it requires a lot of constant coming back to God of like, okay, what do I do in this moment? Because if no one has equipped me, but you knew that I was going to be here in this village or with these people, or so what should I say or what should I ask? So for me, it was a great first experience of like, this is international work, chaotic, exciting, sometimes very boring. You're back in an office typing on a computer like you could do anywhere in the world. And it's just a mixed bag.
Was there a sense of loneliness? I know your prayer was for a friend, but once you got there, was there kind of initial just this is not home, and I'm lonely, I'm missing home?
Yes, I would say, and this would be true of every place I have ever gone. Yeah, even if it was a little bit more of a familiar, closer to my own culture type of environment, I usually always have to have a good cry the first night that I'm there in a new place. You're like, it doesn't smell like me. None of my stuff is here. This is not my bed. This is not my pillow. Like that stuff is a hurdle. No matter how long I have done this type of work, every time I go to a new place, there's always like, this is not my home. And it's just, it's not my home.
I think it's such an important message because if you're dependent on movies or sanitized presentations of 20 or 30 minutes, I think a lot of that stuff gets left out.
Yes.
And I think you could find yourself, if you're feeling like, hey, I wanted to do that. Maybe you're a young person and you go to do a trip and you start to experience that. You might interpret that as, oh, this isn't for me. God clearly isn't calling me to this because I'm having these feelings, and it seems like the people who do this well don't ever feel like that.
Right.
So it's kind of refreshing to hear the honest truth. So this is an internship in Uganda. You keep saying the word mixed bag. It sounds like the way you're describing it is mixed bag. What happens after Uganda?
So I left. Well, I will say to your former question, in Uganda, I did make a friend there later, a few weeks in, who wound up being at every place that I deployed to after with Samaritan's Purse, for the most part, save I think maybe one location, and it was a short-term thing. So he did, from that time, start to give me friends, not just like a plain buddy, but deep friendships that grew in the time that I served with them in different places around the world, and many of whom are still some of my best friends to this day.
Is there an element, it might be a better question for later, but I'll forget it. Is there an element of like, you hear stories, say, of like military veterans who go in, they have all sorts of experiences, traumatic, traveling the world, and then when they come home, they have a really difficult time with friends who just don't have the same experience. It's very hard to connect on these very kind of transformational moments in my life. Very few people can relate to.
Yes, that's very true. And I struggle with that now. I've been back in the U.S. for almost a year, but there's still a sense in which in everyday conversation, anything that happens, something that you might say or, just something that you see, that you eat, what it triggers in my memory can be so vastly unrelatable to the person sitting across from me that it can be difficult to find a way to bring it about and bring it up. And I think if you don't have time and, a depth of relationship with that person, you can also just become that like, oh, well, when I was here and when I was traveling here. Yeah. So it's like either it can be too dramatic or heavy for the moment where you're thinking of something just compared to our day-to-day here is so dramatic or tragic, or it can start to feel like you're just that person who's like, oh, every time you're traveling, but you're like, I'm not traveling, it's my life. Yeah. Like, it's my real life.
Stamp guy.
Yes, yeah. So that's totally has been my experience, and I think a lot of my friends, it can be hard to figure out how to relate, but it's also not an excuse to not try. Like I've forced myself to be like, find a way to bring it up, find a way to share the story in a way that's relatable, or just give people a little context.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, actually I worked here for a while and that reminds me of this. And because if you're going to develop genuine relationship with people, eventually they have to know those things about you. It's your life.
Yeah.
That's been the majority of my 20s I spent doing that kind of work, but it is hard. And I think I dealt actually a lot with that when I came back from Uganda. It was a shorter term experience relatively, but I was there for 4 months. And I just struggled a lot with what I think a lot of college students probably deal with, of like direction in life. What's God doing next? It felt like I had kind of this mountaintop experience. And then I applied for jobs right after, didn't get anything. And actually at that time, this is the fall of 2015. And because of the conflict that was still happening in the Middle East with Islamic State, there was a lot of refugees that were coming from Syria and Iraq, but also other places like Afghanistan, Iran, and even some countries in North Africa into Europe. So we were seeing on the news here, like there's a refugee crisis in Europe. And I had an opportunity when I was in Uganda to be a part of that and take a new job there in Greece. It was going to be in Greece. And I really wanted to, but I felt like God was saying, stay and finish this internship. And I just begrudgingly was kind of like, okay, I'll stay. But then I had kind of these moments of faith of like, I think God's going to provide, I want to go, I want to be a part of that work and serve some way in what's happening in Europe right now. But for some reason, he's asking me to stay here. So I had these moments of like faith, like he's going to provide. But by the time I got back and I was feeling, because of some of my experiences, alienated from some of my peers, I had no direction, no job yet. You're back at your parents' house kind of saying like, all right, this is the beginning of my life crisis. Just wandering around, really not sure, like, do you apply for something here? I just felt very directionless. And I felt like in that time, God was saying, like, do you believe that I can give you the desires of your heart? And I was like, no, yes. Sometimes I do. Yeah. And sometimes it's hard to know what the desires of your heart are. And I think I'm so grateful that God knows me better than I know myself, because he has chosen things far better than I ever would have chosen for myself. But also he sees those flickers in your heart of like, but I know what I created you for.
Yeah.
I know what I created you for, and trust me, like it's going to be good. So that was what he was trying to communicate to me during that time. I did not do a very good job of just resting in that. It was very tumultuous for me. And nonetheless, even though I was not really walking in step with his spirit, he brought, through a connection I had still at Samaritan's Purse, a job forward to go to Greece. I had about 4 or 5 days notice. And they were like, it was one email back to me after I sent kind of a generic update to some people of like, still looking for a job if you want to think of me. And someone emailed back right away and said, do you want to go to Greece? And I emailed back and said, yes. And they said, great. And they sent me a plane ticket, and I left about 4 days later, packed carry-on, and I was going to be there for a month. And I wound up initially staying there for 3 months. And then I came back to the U.S. for about a month, and then got a job for another year, almost year and a half there in Greece.
Yeah. Before we talk about Greece, I'm just curious. When you think about that original stop in Uganda as an internship, what is a moment that you still carry with you, whether it's something beautiful or tragic or whatever it is? Because it sounds to me like you come home, you described it as a mountaintop experience, but it sounds very, very much like what people call like, this is an itch. Like, I have to go back somewhere. Mm-hmm. There's something out there. And you're very honest. It wasn't always beautiful and easy, but there was something about it that you just knew. And I feel like this is what it looks like when people walk in their calling.
Right.
When you think about Uganda even now, what was an experience that you had that just kind of lingers about you?
Yeah, I had one of those days that I described where they, like threw me in the car and were like, go to this place. And I didn't really have clear instructions. I wound up with some of the local Ugandan staff members that were working there. They took me to this church that was, they had something called a church action group that was basically like they would have little microloans between them and they would help support one another in kind of a more formal way as the church body, because they were living in extreme poverty. And I had arrived at the church and they were all waiting for me. And I had honestly no idea why, like no clarity about why I was there and what the purpose of our meeting was, really. But I knew I was supposed to go and see this and meet them. I thought I was going to be observing, not leading anything. And so I was just sitting in front of them and I was like, well, I guess I better ask them questions. So I just was like, so, tell me, like, what has God been doing in your church recently? What are some of the challenges that you're facing? And unlocking that, like, that relationship, that opportunity to sit with a believer in a wildly different place and background than I had ever known or experienced, and hearing the same God at work in their lives and providing for them, I was lit up. Like, it was like, and then we're walking through the village, they're showing me things. This is where we keep our livestock. Here's my house. And it was something about that relationship that, like, just, it was a curiosity. It was exciting. It was interesting. Yeah. That was like, this is cool. Like, I just want to meet people all over the place after this.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the moments that stands out to me.
I love that the realization that despite all the differences, it's the same God.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I had another moment, and I think this was relating more to, like, all throughout that time, fear is always bubbling up. Like, so I'm constantly, even overseas, or, even in Uganda, after all that I've kind of gotten to see these cool things and exciting, and it's, wow, it's so neat, you're learning so much, but I'm still like, okay, like, just dealing with that fear. And we had one weekend where I went with this friend who I had made, and we were going to have an adventurous weekend. We decided to try, and this is one of the fun parts, but it's not all like this. We decided to try kayaking on the Nile. My idea was that I wanted to go on a raft, but she was like, let's do whitewater kayaking. And I am not a water person. I know I'm from California, so I should be, but I do very poorly in water, and I don't like putting my face in the water. Like, I can swim, but like a little frog. And so we went through this whole day. We're in this training. They're teaching you things. When you're in a whitewater kayak, you're like in that. Have you ever done it before?
Yeah.
Like in that sock, Yeah. And so obviously,
semi-waterproof around your waist. Yeah.
Like the trap of death. So like when you flip over, you're stuck. You're going to drown if you don't get yourself out of that. So in my mind, I was like, this is my last day. I'm going to die. And they quickly picked up on my deep anxiety about being trapped in this whitewater kayak. So they gave me another option, which was to go with one of the instructors on like a more, I don't know what it's called, but it's the open ones. And so we're like starting out for the day. We go, and I'm thinking like, now I can enjoy it because I'm safe, because I have this instructor with me. And the first rapids that we hit, he's sitting on the back. He's a local Ugandan man. And he's heavier than I am. So we hit those rapids, and it pings me off like a little catapult into the Nile. And now I'm in the Nile River in these rapids, and I'm like, this is my worst fear. Like, this is what I didn't want to happen, that now it's happened to me. And I felt like this surge of fear, and then God, I really feel like, put this thought in my heart of like, I am the God of the wind and the water. And then I was filled with like this peace, but also an extreme excitement of like, just enjoy it. Like, you're in the Nile River. You enjoy it. It's the Nile. And I did. So I'm like, floating down the river now, and the instructor yanks me back up on the kayak, and, he's laughing. I mean, if you saw it, I mean, I was flung into the air. It looked ridiculous. And we've reached the shore, and he confesses to me that he actually can't swim. So if he had to have jumped into the water and gotten me, like, he was not capable of saving me. But I had entrusted, like, this is going to be a better option, right? This is going to be safe. And
All the things
it was
you assume to be true. It's the guy
yes.
leading you on a kayak trip knows how to swim.
Right. You would hope so. But alas, not the case in the corners of the world like these. And so I felt like it was kind of a funny and sweet way that God was like, again, like, I'm the one who's in control.
That's awesome.
I'm the one.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So just kind of moving forward, you left Uganda, you came home, you said you had an early 20s midlife crisis, and you went again.
Yes.
And Greece, is that right?
Yes, went to Greece, and that was kind of my first opportunity. Initially went and was serving in just a role that they needed in travel and a little bit of HR. But I got connected with a really wonderful woman there who was planning out ministry, like direct ministry programming. So she was walking the streets of Athens, praying and saying, like, God, how do we support your church in this moment? And out of that time with him, she had a vision to kind of create this program that was supporting churches in what they were already doing. So instead of starting something new, to come to them and say, like, you have these refugees that are coming, how can we, as our organization, come alongside and support you? And she created a job for me on that program. And so I got to stay longer term in Greece. And that was, I think, like, that time to me was getting to witness some of the best fruit that was coming out of a really dark situation. There was so many people were looking at that from the lens of, first, you have this terrible war happening in the Middle East that's driving people out of their homes, and it's horrific. And then there was the fear factor side in the West of people saying, well, who are these people crossing our borders? Are they dangerous? Are they going to bring terrorism with them? And there were some instances where that was true.
Yeah.
But from God's perspective, he was in control, and he used that to bring people to himself. So there was so many sweet, wonderful Greek evangelical churches that were coming to the church in the morning. There was refugees sleeping on their doorstep, and they would open up the doors and say, come on in, and they would go back into the kitchen together and make food from Greece and Syria and Iran, and it was wonderful and tasted amazing, and they would talk and share stories. And those believers, the Greek believers, took time away from their own families, money out of their own pockets, took time off of paying jobs to drive refugees to asylum appointments, just for the opportunity to build a relationship so that they could share the gospel. And God used that to bring people to faith.
What is it like in a melting pot when you are experiencing for the first time so many people from so many different places all converging because of devastation and trauma? It's not like, hey, let's all go to Greece on vacation together.
Right.
It's in large part people on foot with whatever they could carry.
Right.
What was that like for you to see that?
So I was living in a part of Athens that was already, before the refugee crisis, had like a larger homeless population. And Greece in particular, I can't speak to the other European countries, but they were in an economic crisis before this happened. So before they had extra tens of thousands of people who didn't have jobs crossing into their country, they were in an economic crisis. So they had a large homeless population. And then now you have these newcomers that are from all around the world, but particularly the Middle East and North Africa. So wandering around the streets, you're hearing Arabic, you're hearing Farsi, you're hearing Greek. There's people who are Greeks that are homeless and have been there for years, just living on the street trying to get by. And then there's little, Muslim families that's like they've got 7 kids and they're running around trying to figure out where to go, how to communicate. They don't speak the language. And so it was, especially in earlier days, kind of a little bit chaotic, especially for kind of the first receiving areas, some of the Greek islands. And typically they would initially arrive and be put into refugee camps. But from there, they were trying to continue their journey. So you'd see them all over the country, and especially in certain pockets of the city. Yeah.
Wow. And how long were you in Greece for?
It was about a year and a half. I left there in the fall of 2017.
Okay. And is that where you were before you go to Iraq?
I spent a year in the Caribbean before that.
Wow.
And that was mainly, there was a series of hurricanes that hit in 2017, like that fall, 2017, Hurricane Maria, and I forget the other one. But it was devastating to Puerto Rico and several other countries. I wound up a little bit in Puerto Rico, and then I went to a country called Dominica in the Eastern Caribbean. That, for me, it felt like kind of a step back in some ways, because I felt like I was kind of gearing towards, more interaction with people from the Middle East and these ministry programs, working with churches. And then to kind of go over to the Caribbean, I was like, this doesn't feel like it's part of the plan. But God really used that time to give me some of the skills I needed in management and programming that I wound up using later once I actually got to Iraq. So that was about a year. And then by the time it was February of 2019, I got my feet were wet in northern Iraq and learning programming there.
So you had seen a little bit of the effects of what was happening in Greece because you were seeing people fleeing.
Yes.
What was your initial impression of actually being in Iraq? So I think of all the places you're describing, this has an image in the American imagination of what this place is like. Years and years in the news cycle, you have this idea of what that place is like, who lives there. Did you have kind of that pre-built-in image of what you were getting into? And then how did that compare to what you actually experienced?
Yes, I did. I mean, again, I had the burning desire to go. And I really think that was an indicator from God of like, I'm asking you to go.
I'd imagine a burning desire in a place that's probably preloaded with, this is a place to be afraid of.
Yes. And so with that, I think I still had this fear, and I didn't have much time to prepare to go. So I had about a 10-day period where it was like I was in Dominica, finishing a contract there. I went back to the U.S. for 10 days, traded out my, sundresses for Middle East appropriate clothing. So that was kind of a very short window to get my head around, I'm going to this place that has all this fear associated with it. One of the most helpful things for me was talking to, I mentioned her earlier in Greece, that woman who started ministry programming there. She had experience living and working in Afghanistan. And I was sharing with her some of these fears that I had, just personal safety, what will happen to me. And she said that, and I think it's important to understand that she experienced a lot of loss and fearful things when she was in Afghanistan. So coming out on the other side of that experience, she shared with me, like when I was thinking and worrying and projecting in fear ahead of actually going, it was totally without the peace and presence of God. So all of these things that you're wondering, will this happen? If it happens, what will I do? How will I feel? Is it worth it? Are completely without his peace and presence. He's not in your worrying.
That's wise.
Yeah, it was so wise. And so that helped free me to say, like, and it's a constant recommitting, I think, to say, like, okay, God, you've brought me this far. I know that you're faithful, and I know that you have my good in mind. You tell me that in your word. So I have to trust that you're going to continue to be with me and provide for my good and your glory every step of the way. And worrying in advance, you're not in that. So I'm not feeling that peace from you because it's not a real thing. We're not in that moment of need. And so that helped free me a little bit from some of that in advance fearing. And as soon as I got there, I think people don't understand that there's a whole part of northern Iraq, kind of the Kurdish territory. I landed in a city called Erbil. It's relatively modern. So you're driving around and you're feeling like, okay, like this is not what we see on the news. There's nice restaurants here. I'm getting some, new friends are taking you to some fun coffee shops. And it helped as a good little entry point to say, like, there's something familiar. Although I was actually going to be based about an hour and a half away from that city in a small Christian town in the Nineveh Plains. So it's literally Nineveh, where Jonah was. And that was small town, dirt roads for the most part. There's some paved now, especially because the Pope visited, so they had to really clean things up before his arrival. It was great.
Funny how that happens.
Yes. I mean, the local Iraqis were like, it's been broken for 10 years and you fix it in 1 week, but this road that he's not going on, But
I think that just happened. Was it San Francisco? The leader of China came, and all of a sudden they're like, wow, you cleaned up all the streets.
Yeah.
Funny how that happened.
Yeah, you just need someone important enough. Yeah.
So you're in Iraq. I don't want to forget this because we were talking about it on Sunday, and it really struck me. You had said something about safety, and that there's wisdom and precautions to take in safety. But sometimes where God calls you and gives you peace is God wants to reach places that are not safe, and sometimes there's kind of a risk analysis that you just have to live with. How do you navigate the reality that maybe some of these places in some ways aren't safe, but you're still called to go there? I think there's definitely a safety and comfort culture that is okay with going places, but we always want to know what's the crime rate, what's the homelessness, and we're analyzing the risk. But when you're called by God to do a lot of these sorts of things, you're not always working off the same rubric of safety. You're working off of God's called me, and so I'm going.
Right. Yeah, I think on kind of a human logic side, the organization itself had a security department. They're doing research. They're kind of equipping you with some of these things. Like, this is what it's like. Here's some do's and don'ts, and helping you figure out, you can drive in this area, but as a single woman alone, you shouldn't be driving. And particularly as a foreigner, you shouldn't be driving alone in this area. There's some practical pieces that I think, it's wise if you're going to a place, whether that is personally, something that I was doing on my side or a part of an organization that you're joining to do. But like you said, it's such a different, when you're living in northern Iraq, every day you're passing through checkpoints with heavily armed militia. Many of them are backed by Iran, which doesn't have the best relationship with the U.S. There are different parts of the country that are regularly hit by airstrikes, just as a regular part of life there, and some of the conflict and tensions that are there. So when you first enter, I think there is an appropriate period of time where you're learning a new normal. What would be very alarming if we stepped out into our streets and found those things to be true here in Southern California, there it's the norm and it's not an indicator of something being wrong. And I think that takes a lot, again, on kind of the human logic research side of learning from locals and other expats who have been there a while to take cues of like, when do I actually need to get worried and when am I okay? So I think those were some pieces practically that anywhere you go, you have to be prepared for just the discomfort of like, my alarms are going off, but they don't need to be, because in this context, this is still safe.
Yeah.
But right before that, in that 10-day or so period before I had gone to Iraq, there was this really tragic incident where a private plane crashed into one of the streets in our neighborhood. And everyone in the plane passed away, and of course in the home. And it was in the middle of when I was grappling with, like, I'm going to this very unsafe place. What if, And I think God used that. Of course, it was a tragedy, but from a perspective shaping point for me, it highlighted that we are always in the hands of God, and at any moment, at any time, anywhere you are, no matter how safe from a human logic standpoint you think you are, we're completely contingent on Him to take care of us. And to say that Southern California is more safe than Northern Iraq is leaning on my own human understanding. And so I think there's a wisdom that comes with knowing where you're going, and doing some research in advance of how should I dress and what areas to avoid, and leaning on locals and all of that. And that should be done. But I think ultimately, if He really is affirming, like, yeah, go to this place, then He equips you to do it. And I think He reinforced that. For me, there was a time when we were there, I had been there a couple of years, so I'd tuned up to like what the norm was in our area. And there was kind of a heightened season where there was more tensions for various reasons in our area. And at that time, actually, there was another NGO that had a vehicle that was driving to visit a site that our organization was associated with, and they hit an IED. It's a, man-made explosive on the road. They were in an armored vehicle, so they were mostly okay, but injured, certainly. Our organization did not use armored vehicles. And it was on a road that I went on, maybe not daily, but very frequently, because it was the one road between that main city, Erbil, and the place that I was living. And at that time, we were called back to kind of another location, safer area, just to see, like, is this a new rise in kind of tensions? What's happening? But we were there for a few weeks, and it wound up kind of being determined by leadership, like, it's okay to go back. But they had asked us, and this was not the norm. I get this question a lot of, like, did you have to cover your head as a woman living in northern Iraq? I did not. But in this time, they asked us traveling in vehicles to cover our heads so that if you were looking from the road trying to target foreigners, it was not obvious that there was a foreigner in the car. So they were like, we want to transport you back to your field sites, but we've determined that you should wear these head coverings. And, we were nervous because we were like, we're going to go on the same road that this vehicle just hit. And they're asking us to do something that is not the norm here because they're saying people might be trying to target us. And that felt like one of the first, more than just a generic kind of security risk. It felt like more of a specific, potentially personal threat that we were facing. And I was with one of my good friends. She and I were meant to travel back together with a local driver. And so we were in the office before, they're trying to make it fun. You're picking out your scarf, trying on different ones. Like, this one looks good, great, but we're nervous. You're like, it doesn't matter if it brings out my eyes, I'm nervous. But our driver, he was a local Muslim man. Great relationship with our organization, helped get us in a lot of tough places and out of a lot of tough situations. So he was trusted and just a huge asset. He was transporting us. So we were like, okay, we've got a good one, we've got a good one. And we're on the road. We were getting ready to put our headscarves on because we're getting to that point where we're supposed to need it. And we're sitting in the back seat. He's driving. And he kind of tells us, like, okay, we're coming up to this point. He didn't speak much English, but we're learning a little bit of Arabic. And so we try to put him on, but it's very different when you're an American trying to do, the headscarf. It's a technique. And previously we had been with an office assistant who she's, Kurdish, Muslim. She's a pro. So she made us look really good. And however we chose to do it was so hysterical to the driver that he laughed like I have never seen a man, particularly in that culture, like so exuberant, dying laughing, crying laughing, because we looked ridiculous in his eyes. And it was all, so he's dying laughing, and then we're dying laughing. And now we're all hysterical. We're passing through this place where previously the car had struck the explosive, and we're through that area still laughing. And then before you know it, we're back at our home, pulling into the village, hopping out of the car. And it's like this great memory. And it was just some sweet thing I felt like that God did in that moment of like, you don't need to be afraid. Nothing's going to happen. You don't need to be afraid. And now my friend and I kind of look back at that of like, we were so nervous, but now it's just this hilarious, really uncharacteristic memory of that driver who was our friend. And yeah.
I'm reminded, it's sometimes cliche, but I think it fits, is people throw around the phrase, the joy of the Lord is our strength. Mm-hmm. Sounds like that. Yeah. It's a tangible example of a time you needed strength and God gave it to you, and laughter.
Yes, totally.
So just give us a time kind of stamp. Where are we just in years at this point?
As far as how many years I've been international. Well,
I guess that, but what year is this?
I think it is 2019. Oh, no, it's 2021.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how was kind of COVID experienced in these places?
Yeah, it's interesting. When COVID hit for us, it was difficult, like all the world, things were shut down. So they pulled everybody who was in different field sites back to the city of Erbil because there's an airport there, and there was more staff housing and things like that. It's just kind of a safer place for everybody to camp out and see what happened in this situation. But it was really challenging because all your programs and your local teams are living and working in other places. So now you're moving, similar to everybody else, to a remote management situation. But there's also a hard aspect of feeling like you get to be the ones as a foreigner who's pulled out, but the locals stay. And yeah, so we were back in Erbil, and it was like things there was some other tensions not related to COVID at that time that they were concerned about, why they wanted us to be close to the airport too, in case we needed to leave for other reasons. But because of COVID, the airport wound up shutting down. So we were all just kind of hanging out in it's a housing complex that looks like a gated community here in the U.S. Big, beautiful homes, very modern, with pretty much, it was like quarantining with 20 of your close friends. So that aspect from a personal side was fun.
Just on its face, what do you think the 12 to 15-year-old version of you would have thought if you knew that you were going to be locked down in northern Iraq with no way out?
Sure. Yeah. It's like now we're trapped. I mean, I think I would have been pretty nervous. But at the time, it's so totally it's completely out of your control that there's something about situations when it's so out of your control that it's almost freeing. Because that's the reality always. Yeah. But I think when God reminds you of like, you have no control over the airport, these political tensions, this disease, so you're just going to have to sit tight. You're like, all right. And I had in that time some personal health issues. I have since been diagnosed with ulcerative colitis. That was first showing up then, and I didn't know what it was. So I was like, no airport. There were some good doctors, but limited compared to maybe what I could have figured out in the States. I was not interested in getting a colonoscopy in northern Iraq. I did have a root canal there once, though. different story. But yeah, so there was personal anxiety for me in that sense of being trapped. But again, I remember talking on the phone to my parents, like, worst case scenario, it's a deadly disease, right? Like I have cancer and I'm seeing the beginning signs, which is like, if you look it up on the internet, it's always cancer.
It's always bad. Yeah.
You're like, it's always something life-threatening. So don't do it. Yeah. But I did because, I was lacking wisdom clearly. But it was like, but there's nothing I can do. And God knows. He knows exactly what's happening in my body right now in this moment. And he knows how to fix it. So, and he knows when I'll be able to get care for that. Yeah. So that aspect personally was tough. But eventually the airport did reopen. We were able to travel out on some chartered flights from another, like a branch of the UN, actually chartered flights for expats that were trying to get home. And I was able to get out. But that season for Iraqis was interesting because they viewed it as it was a challenge, but it's not super memorable to them. It didn't mark them in the way that I think it marked a lot of, at least of, my American friends here and family here, because I think in part they have a little bit, they have said this to me, like, people die sometimes. And you're like, yeah, but, it's death. But they live in a place where, because of different conflicts, because sometimes there's a lack of medical care in certain areas, death is more of an accepted part of their lives. That's not to say that they do not deeply grieve. They have a lot of depth to their grieving, and it's long and lots of kind of processes around that, their mourning period. But there was more of an acceptance. And then compared to when in more recent history, Islamic State had occupied some of their cities, there was, for Muslims in particular, who stayed in the cities like the city of Mosul, where Islamic State occupied, they lived under ISIS for years. And it was more than the duration of the COVID shutdown. And the threat of going out to them was much greater than what they were facing from a disease. People, I think they associate ISIS with all Muslims, but that was a more extreme group, and there was a lot of Muslims that lived under them when they occupied their cities and towns that were not sympathetic to them. And if you were not joining them, then you were their enemy. So they were persecuted the same, and in some areas worse than like Christian people groups, for example.
Wow.
So for them, they're looking back in recent history, it's well within their lifetime, just a few years before, and saying comparatively, this is small.
It's probably an offline conversation, but I'd love to just pick your brain. I got to imagine there's so much nuance of all of these things that when you watch some news clips and you come away with this is how that part of the world operates, that is just not true or not complete or totally lacking information. I'd love to hear about that maybe another time. But so you come back from Iraq. You're here. What is kind of the reintroduction? You touched on it a little bit, but how did it compare this time? So the reason we're talking is because you're home from there.
Right.
How did that compare to that first coming home from Uganda for you?
It's a good question. I felt God gave me a long preparation period for leaving Iraq. Like when I was in, that was 2020. So in the fall of 2021, I got to be a part of a response that our organization did at that time that was serving Afghans that were fleeing when the U.S. was pulling out and the Taliban was taking over. I wasn't in Afghanistan. I was in one of the Gulf countries. And it was the first time that I had really looked up from the Nineveh Plains in the last few years. I had been living, breathing that people group, that place all day, every day, invested and wanted to stay in northern Iraq. Like, I really wanted to stay. But as soon as I got there, we were interacting with these Afghans. It was kind of this historic moment to witness and be a part of. I just felt, again, in a way that I hadn't in a little while, that fresh passion of like, God is at work here. And this is another opportunity of people who are being pushed out of what is characteristically a hostile country towards the gospel into places where they will only continue to have opportunities to know him more compared to where they're coming from. That is, again, not to say that they didn't suffer horrifically and have terrible, terrible, tragic loss along the way. But there was that aspect of what God was doing and how he was viewing it. And he's always interested in people knowing who he is. That's his goal. So it lit that fire again. And I think that was the first time in a little while that he was reminding me, like, you can love many different things. Like, I've created you to be able to work in and love in many different things and places. And I was, maybe holding a little bit too tightly to this one thing, Northern Iraq, my program and my team there that I loved. So that was the first time I kind of looked up. And then in the year that followed, he just made it clear, like, I'm asking you to leave. And that was important for the time when I was coming home, because it gave a greater sense of security of knowing this was his plan. But he made me more aware of how tired I was. I was very, very tired and not operating at the same capacity that I had been when I started, and little breaks weren't really cutting it. And I had a really wonderful, staff member and friend we were working on the team together, and he was completely capable of leading it. He was my program coordinator. I was managing the program, and it's like, you can do this. So why am I here? And it just made sense to hand it over to him. And then I was working with a team of 20 Iraqis. So to add me in as this, middle piece that you now have to translate, because I know rudimentary phrases, it's like he can operate all in Arabic. He can do it a more local way. And he was just really,
it's powerful,
discerning, and God equipped him really beautifully to do that job. And we had worked alongside each other and shared a lot of moments and vision, and felt like we're tuned into each other, and God is asking us to, pass the baton. So those pieces, coupled with, they also from a larger organizational standpoint, closed the base that I was living on. So I moved at the very end of my time to another city, and I was commuting sometimes 2 or 3 hours one way in a day. Now, I wouldn't do that I would do it maybe two times a week, 2 or 3 times a week for that season. But that was the tail end of my time. And I was like, this is not sustainable. You're counting you've gone through 12 checkpoints, and it's just a hassle to do that. Though there are many staff that do, and many locals, more importantly, that do it. So those pieces really helped give me the confidence to say, like, I know that you're asking me to leave, even though I love it here. I love for the people, and I don't necessarily want to, but I am tired. And you've provided clearly another person to take the baton.
Yeah.
So that gave me a greater sense of peace and assurance entering into this time that it was his plan. Whereas I think back in Uganda, it was so early on, I had just gotten a taste. So it was kind of like this halt when you were like, but I've got all this momentum. And now it was like, I've had 7.5 years of following you around the world, like into these little towns, into these camps, and now you're asking me to go back to my home. And I didn't know exactly what that would look like, but I had planned out some intentional things I wanted to do in my break. I thought initially that I would be, I think maybe like 4 months or so, but I had a few people give me advice of like, it really takes like at least 6 to start to really restore. And so it did end up being longer.
Could I ask you a question, just going back a little bit? You talked about this moment where you were part of the relief effort of people fleeing Afghanistan. So this is an American event that kind of is still lingering. A lot of people know that event. They know what they've been told. I don't know if it's true or false, but that's not my question.
Right.
Sometimes what happens when we have these big pivotal events and we might hear something like, 50,000 people flee and they enter these countries that we couldn't find on a map, many people, right? But I think it's really important because you're saying this provided an opportunity for the gospel to go forward. But for you, this is not a number on a page, 50,000 people enter this place. You know names, you know faces of the real people. So this is not just a statistic.
Right.
And no matter what you think about religious differences or cultural differences, you're called to serve them. So I'm just curious because I think people will hear this and they'll think, I know what happened when we withdrew from Afghanistan. And maybe that might be in reality part of the story, but the backside of the story is something that I think you could uniquely speak to. Do you have a story or a family or something that comes to mind that might help people see a different side of that story and who that impacted?
Yeah, I think... Well, there's 2 things that strike me. The first is less of a story, more of a reality of what it was like there. Like when Afghans were fleeing, they were, put on a plane. They didn't know where the plane was going. They didn't always have seats. Sometimes they're just sitting on the floor of that plane. And then it lands somewhere, usually at night, because that was often the safest time to take off. So they land usually in the middle of the night in a new country. They don't know where they are and they don't speak the language and they're ushered out, into these lines. People are, even not in a hostile way, but yelling because the crowd is big to get in certain areas. And where we were, they were coming onto a U.S. Air Force base in the Gulf countries that they would put them in one hangar where there might be, biometrically scanned and they'd figure out who's there, who they are, where do they need to go, who's related to who, or they wouldn't always have time, so they would put them on another plane and they'd send them on their way. And they were sometimes having to wait for an indefinite amount of time. You're in that hangar, you haven't eaten, you haven't showered, you don't have any extra clothes. You came with what's on your back. You've, left your home, you're never going back. And you probably had a very traumatic experience on the way to the airport getting there. And we saw families that in their desperate understanding of the situation would try to send their kids on a plane that they heard say was going to Germany or the US and separate from them. Their thinking possibly forever, because they think that will give their kids a better life. And yeah, and I think that reality of what it was like for them in that moment, it was a really harrowing experience. And they were just kind of ushered from place to place. With that, too, another thing that struck me was the way that the U.S. military responded in that moment, I thought was really beautiful and just bolstered my respect for them. I always kind of had a distant, I respect them, but that was the first time I'd ever gotten to work closely with them. And they had pretty much every branch of the military was represented there, of our U.S. military. And they served above and beyond to try to get people medical care, food, change of clothes, at least somewhere to sit that was semi-comfortable. I mean, they had thousands and thousands of people in, plane hangars. There's no airflow. It's super hot and humid. People are, and they were staying up all night sometimes, doing their normal shift, whatever it was that they were meant to do in their normal job, and then serving.
Wow.
And that struck me because I knew that there was a lot of them that disagreed from a political policy perspective with how things had been handled. And a lot of them had personally invested decades in Afghanistan. And so to see them serving in that moment, with kindness and patience, there is not one time that I saw them lose their temper. And there was times when they knew that they were, either dealing with people who were maybe more sympathetic to the Taliban. There was definitely people who jumped on that were not meant to be evacuated, that they're trying to filter out and deal with that security risk at the same time of caring for this mom and her children who just need care and are totally innocent. And they just dealt with that in a really incredible way. So that's another piece. But the story that I thought of is there was one day that so the response that we were doing was just kind of helping supply different types of materials that the military was going to then distribute. And so I would hop in the car. We would go to a distribution center that they had set up, and I would ask, what do you need? Sometimes we'd walk around, kind of assess, and then I would go back and try to get the supplies. And that was sort of my job, was just helping operate some different things. And we had different teams out doing different types of projects on the ground. And in the midst of that, I was walking around with, again, I've mentioned her now 3 times, but the woman who I met back in Greece, she was a part of this response. She, if you remember, had experience in Afghanistan. So they brought her on this response because she had some language skill. And we met early on in our time there. He was a colonel in the Army or Air Force. I don't remember which.
Okay.
Sadly. He was walking around and he was a chaplain. He would just pray while he was walking around, just pray over people, even if he couldn't out loud, just was walking and was so burdened by the people that he'd met and what he was seeing. He had no language ability. And he heard my friend speaking to some women who were waiting in a line to get clothes. And he looked at her and said, do you speak Dari? And she said, yes. And, she was like, I'm a little rusty, but... and he said, okay, translate what I say. And so he called a group of women over that were all waiting in this line, young, old, very mixed group, all women. And they gathered around, and he started sharing the full gospel from start to finish, just walked them through this is the story. But I forgot to say, he's opened by saying, how many of you here have heard of Jesus? And there was one woman in the back that raised her hand, a young woman. No one else had heard of him.
Wow.
So he walked them through the full gospel story, told them this is who Jesus is, this is what he's done for you. Anyone can profess faith in him. It's not just a God that's for Christians or, a specific religion or ethnicity. He is for everyone, and he wants a relationship with you. She translated it, and she was as someone who had worked in Afghanistan and had years of experience there, watched the cost that missionaries went through to bring the gospel, to be able to be, and they did see people come to faith, but it looked different, to be able to be there standing in an open hangar with thousands of Afghans around you and have this U.S. military, personnel share the gospel through you was an incredible moment. And it just was like, for me, I just got to stand there and witness it.
Wow.
It was like, this is what he's doing. Like, God just brought this specific group of women out to stand in this line in this airport hangar in the middle of this country in the Gulf, so that this full bird colonel, who was like, they can fire me if they want, but at this point, I've had years of service in the military. What are they going to do? Could share the gospel.
Wow.
And he took his moment. And that, to me, was the true narrative in God's eyes of what he was doing in that moment.
That's beautiful. So you're home now.
Yes.
And I think you had told me, but hopefully not for much longer.
Yes.
Tell people what might be next for you, what you hope to be next for you.
Yeah, so I, in the last month or so, started working for a small missions organization called Ananias House. They're founded by a Syrian believer who grew up in a ministry family in Syria. His dad is a well-known pastor kind of in the church network there. And he was really struck with how conflict in their region and persecution in their region was driving leaders out from the church and leaving kind of this vacuum of leadership. And so there was this need to raise up new young leaders from among believers in Syria. And so God gave him the vision to bring biblical training to that group of people. He had the opportunity to study like in the West. So he did some schooling in the US, did some in the UK, and got to kind of see some of the resources that were present in Western churches, and wanted to see how he could build kind of a bridge from the West to the Middle East and North Africa, these believers in Muslim majority countries where there was less access to be able to go to seminary and with that persecution and things like that are driving leaders out. So kind of the first thing they did as an organization was start these pastor leader trainings where they would take people from the West to initially kind of bring materials and give those seminary courses. They commit to a group for about 4 to 5 years. The same group of people come back year after year, and they meet multiple times in that year. They kind of train them up, and then the goal is that that group of locals in whatever country, if it's Syria or wherever, would be able to replicate that and train more, kind of like a mobile seminary.
Wow.
So cool vision, really cool guy with an amazing heart for just that part of the world, his people, but more than his people, the Middle East and North Africa. And they've expanded their work from there. So they do, if they've got a church partner in Turkey, Turkey's hit with an earthquake. Now the partner's saying, well, what we really need is relief supplies. That's what's going to strengthen our church in the moment, so they can provide that. But their whole goal is to follow the lead of the church in that area, to communicate back to the church here in the West the needs and reality of believers there in the Middle East and North Africa, and to just strengthen the church there, and continue to equip them to face persecution, because that's only an ever-growing reality for them, day in and day out. So that's the organization. And yeah, they're called Ananias House. I am doing a hodgepodge of things for them right now. Been gathering some stories from the field of local believers in, they call it the MENA, Middle East and North Africa, MENA region, so that we can communicate that back to donors and just partners here in the U.S. And then
if somebody wanted to see that and have a visual, do you do like a newsletter? Is there a website, something that...
Of the organization itself, there is a website, ananiashouse.org. Yeah.
I'll put it in the link description
Cool.
on YouTube, so if people want to see what that's about.
Yes, and you can sign up for their newsletter on there too, which is a great way to get updates. So,
Very cool. And before I forget, I know that you have Instagram. Is there a place that if people are like, as you go, by the way, what country are you hoping to land in?
Hopefully I will go to Lebanon. I can do a lot remotely, and if it means I maybe have to shift because of the current conflict in Israel to doing things remotely or taking trips and can't quite live there yet, then I may do that longer next year. But the goal would be for me to move to Lebanon early next year.
Okay. And if people wanted to just kind of see what you're up to and what you're doing, where can they see that? I imagine people are going to hear this. They're going to be excited about it. They're going to want to see visually, like, what does it look like? What are you doing?
Yeah.
How can we support you? So I guess the first question is, how can people see that?
I am an Instagram user.
Okay, we'll put a link to that as
So
well.
Instagram. And from a more personal update side, I will send out a newsletter. So email addresses are great.
Okay, so if people followed you on Instagram and then message you
Shoot me
and
a
said,
message
"Hey, I
and
love
say,
that. Here's my
yeah.
email." Okay, that's a great way to do that. One kind of final question for you. One thing I love about doing this podcast and having so many different experiences and backgrounds and callings, all kind of just captive audience, is I love what I hear from younger people feeling like I heard that one and that one really kind of hit me. I feel like I'm hearing maybe what God's calling me into in that person's story. Maybe there's a young gal or a young guy. Maybe they're at a place where they went to Mexico with our youth group and they're starting to feel like, man, that freaked me out, but I loved it and I want to go back. And maybe the beginning, kind of how that started for you. What would you say to a young person who's thinking like, wow, I just heard that. I feel like when she's describing the burning desire to go back to a place, I kind of feel like I might have that. What would you say to somebody who's maybe beginning the very starting point of wanting to walk that out?
Yeah, I think one piece of advice that someone gave me early on was, and I think this is kind of common. I struggle with it even now. Like, I want kind of the full picture, right? It's common to say, like, God, show me, where am I going to go, or what am I going to do, or what should I do with my life? And that's a really big question that mostly he doesn't seem to work in that way, right? Like, he reveals things progressively. So, I had someone use the image of like, he just gives you enough light for the next step. And so I think a lot of times in working out our calling, it's about just taking the next step right before you. I never would have been, and I hope that's clear in my story, like there was no moment, we joked about that earlier, where he opened the skies and there was a neon sign of like, this is what you're going to do. It was a progressive growing understanding, growing in my own faith and relationship with him to where he slowly, in a way that was appropriate and fitting for me, what I could handle, revealed to me what his plan was and is continuing to do that today. I'm still in a place of I could be moving to the Middle East in a couple weeks or I could not. And that's kind of a wild, it's like, okay, I mean, that feels dramatic, but to me, it's like he's going to make it clear. And right now I'm kind of in a yellow light period of like, I'm in the waiting zone. I've said I'm willing to go. So I think that aspect of just asking God to show you what is my next logical step that you've put in front of me and not relying on, a big dramatic sign, but just saying like, Lord, I'm willing to do whatever it is, whether it's going international or not, having that conversation and not being, and this is a journey, I think, in all aspects of faith, but not being guided by feeling. Like if I was only guided by a feeling, I would have always been feeling fear. And you have to at some point say like, okay, he's given me the burning desire. There's still fear here, but it says in your word to go and make disciples. And if my heart is to be engaged in that in any way, whether it's here, whether it's in a different, part of the world, that's aligned with your will. How that works out specifically, he'll make it clear. But yeah, I think that's kind of where I've landed.
I love that. I think my favorite part about this conversation is it just is so obvious no matter where you've landed that you love people and recognize that in any circumstance and context there's opportunities to serve people. So I love that. I often end, and I was reading on Sunday, actually, not long after we had a conversation. We sat after church and chatted for a while. And I was prepping for my midweek, and I was thinking about exactly what you just said. You could get a phone call and be given a few days to get on a plane and go to Lebanon, and you just don't know. And I was reading this, and I just felt like God was telling me to circle back. So I read it again, and I just felt like this is for you. I feel like this is a nugget just to take with you whenever that journey begins. But this comes from Ephesians chapter 3, and it's at the end of the chapter. It starts in, what I'm going to quote, starts at verse 16. It says this. According to the riches of his glory, he may grant you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your heart through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may have strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. I think that's kind of a scripture prayer I would have for you, that I think so often people get burnt out and have all kinds of crises, but I think it's so obvious in your story, the thing that's holding you together is that God has called you, and no matter how difficult sometimes that is, you always have something to lean back on, that I'm here with a purpose, and even if I can't see it, I know that I've said yes to something God's called me to, and that's not shaky ground. That's the most stable ground you could be on.
That's right.
So I hope that as you go, whenever that might be, that it would be just full-blown walking in the calling that you have, that God's love for you goes before you and behind you and beside you.
Thank you.
But unless you have something else to say, we could sign off here.
No, that's it. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you so much. I can't wait for people to hear this. And there's a selfish part of me that hopes that when they hear this, that you're still here so they can talk to you. But it's entirely possible by the time this one airs, you might be long gone, and we'll follow you from afar.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Haley. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.